Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves had been away from home for a long time. The desert heat of the deployment zone was a far cry from the quiet patch of green land he had back in his hometown. That small piece of property wasn't much to look at, just a grassy lot with a few trees and a worn fence, but it meant something to him. It was his late father's land, passed down with a handshake and a promise. Daniel had dreams of building a small cabin there one day when military life finally gave him a chance to settle down when he left for deployment. He wasn't worried about it. The property tax on that lot was barely anything, and he'd set up automatic payments. There were no bills to worry about, no buildings to maintain, no tenants to deal with. As far as he knew, the land was just sitting there, waiting for him, like it always had. Daniel had asked his younger brother, Matt, to keep an eye on his mail while he was gone. Matt wasn't the most organized person in the world, but Daniel figured it wasn't a big job. Most of his important stuff came through military channels or email anyway. The rest was usually junk credit card offers, donation requests, and the occasional magazine subscription that never seemed to end. What, Daniel didn't know, was that a thin stack of letters with official-looking seals had been arriving every few weeks. Envelopes were marked with the return address of something called Green Pines Homeowners Association. Daniel had never heard of them, and for good reason. He'd never been part of any homeowners association in his life. But these letters were persistent, showing up like clockwork. Matt, figuring it was just spam or some weird mistake, tossed them into a cardboard box in the corner of his living room, along with pizza coupons and unread flyers. He meant to mention them to Daniel during one of their short, rushed phone calls. But somehow, between bad connections and the usual house everything, you staying safe? Small talk. The topic never came up. While Daniel was patrolling dusty streets half a world away, the people running the Green Pines HOA were having meetings about him, meetings he didn't know existed. According to their records, his land was part of their jurisdiction, something they claimed had been decided years ago when the surrounding subdivision expanded. They said he owed maintenance fees for landscaping, security patrols, and community improvements. Even though Daniel's lot wasn't connected to their water lines, had no road access through their gates, and was basically just a strip of grass outside their manicured streets. In one meeting, the HOA president, a sharp-dressed man with a permanent frown named Harold Peterson, waved Daniel's file in the air like it was a personal insult. "This Reeves guy hasn't paid a dime," Harold said. "We've sent him notices. We've been patient. And I think it's time we take action. We can't have freeloaders." They voted without hesitation to start the process of placing a lien on the property. None of them seemed to care that Daniel was deployed overseas, or that his unpaid fees were something he'd never agreed to in the first place. To them, he was just a name on paper and a piece of land they could grab. Back home, life moved quietly in Daniel's absence. His land sat untouched, the grass growing taller, the fence leaning a little more each month. Sometimes a local kid would cut through on his bike, leaving tire tracks in the dirt. Once an elderly neighbor left a bag of pears from her tree by the gate, not knowing Daniel wouldn't be back to enjoy them. Meanwhile, in that box in Matt's living room, the letters kept piling up. They started polite. Reminder, your HOA dues are past due. Then they turned colder. Final notice before legal action. Finally, they grew downright threatening. Lien proceedings will begin if payment is not received by. Followed by a date that came and went without anyone noticing. Daniel, busy with missions, training, and the constant mental weight of staying alive, had no idea any of this was happening. To him, home was a mental picture he carried in his mind when the days were hard. A picture where nothing changed unless he wanted it to. The day the certified letter arrived, Matt wasn't home to sign for it. The postal worker left a bright orange slip on the door, and that slip ended up under a stack of magazines. The letter went back to the sender. That was the HOA's last required step before moving forward with their plan. Somewhere in their tidy, air-conditioned office, Harold Peterson smiled as he signed the papers to start the auction process. He'd already spoken to a developer friend who had big plans for that corner lot. Plans that involved flipping it for 10 times the auction price once he had the deed. Back overseas, Daniel was sitting in a cramped barracks room cleaning his gear and thinking about how good it would feel to be home. He imagined walking the land, hearing the crunch of leaves under his boots. Maybe even hammering the first board of that cabin he'd always talked about. The idea that someone else could be plotting to take it from him wasn't just far from his mind. It was unthinkable. It wasn't until months later, during a short video call with his mom, that Daniel got his first hint something was wrong. She asked in a casual tone, "Hey, did you ever pay that neighborhood thing? I think Matt said you were getting some letters." "What neighborhood thing?" Daniel asked, frowning. His mom shrugged. "I don't know, something about fees. I thought it was a scam." Daniel felt a flicker of unease, but before he could press for details, the connection froze and the screen went black. He told himself he'd ask Matt later, but later in deployment always seemed to be weeks away. By the time Daniel learned the truth, the papers had been signed, the sale had gone through, and his name was no longer on the deed. The people who had taken it from him had no idea they'd just picked a fight with someone who knew exactly how to get it back, someone who had the law, the military, and his own stubborn will on his side. When Daniel finally came home for a short leave, he was looking forward to one thing: peace. The plane ride felt longer than it really was, and every mile brought him closer to the land he had missed for months. He pictured it just as he'd left it, maybe a little overgrown, but still his. The morning after he arrived, he drove his old pickup out toward the lot. The air felt different, cooler, calmer. He rolled the windows down, breathing in the smell of fresh pine. As he got closer, something felt off. At the corner where his fence should have been, there was nothing but a wide, muddy patch of dirt. The fence posts were gone, and in their place was a small white sign stuck into the ground. Daniel pulled over and walked up to it, in big black letters it read, "Private property, no trespassing, owned by Green Pines Development Group." He stared at it, blinking, certain he was reading it wrong. His first thought was that it was some kind of prank, but as he looked around, he saw more changes. The grass had been cut down to dirt. Orange survey markers dotted the edges. Tire tracks crisscrossed the ground. His stomach tightened. He drove straight to the county records office, the little building where deeds and titles were stored. Inside, the clerk typed his name into the computer, then frowned. "I'm sorry," she said. "There's no property listed under Daniel Reeves." "That's impossible," he said. "It's my land. I've had it for years." "Check again." She turned the monitor so he could see. His name wasn't there. Instead, the owner listed was Green Pines Development Group, purchased at an HOA auction 2 months earlier. The clerk explained, as if it were routine, that the HOA had the right to sell property when fees went unpaid. Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. Unpaid fees. "I've never agreed to be part of any HOA. My land isn't in a subdivision. It's just a piece of open land." The clerk shrugged. "According to their maps, it's part of their jurisdiction now. They sent notices you didn't pay. They auctioned it." For a moment, Daniel just stood there, gripping the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. He'd spent years defending his country, and now someone had stolen his land while he was away, and his father had worked hard to buy land that was supposed to be his future. He drove straight to the Green Pines HOA office, a shiny building with glass doors and a manicured lawn. Inside, the air smelled like fresh paint and coffee. At the front desk, a young receptionist gave him a polite but guarded smile. "I need to speak to Harold Peterson." "Oh," Daniel said, "do you have an appointment?" She asked. "No," he said, "but tell him it's about property he thinks he owns." Her smile faded, and she made a quick phone call. Moments later, a tall man in a press suit came out from an office down the hall. His hair was perfectly combed, his shoes polished. This was Harold Peterson. "Mr. Reeves," Harold said smoothly, as if he'd been expecting him. "I figured we might see you eventually." "You sold my land," Daniel said, his voice low but hard. Harold tilted his head. "Correction, we reclaimed it. You failed to pay your dues, and as per the HOA bylaws, we exercised our right to auction it. Everything was done legally." Daniel stepped closer. "I never signed any agreement with you. I was deployed. You can't just take property from someone serving overseas." Harold's smile didn't waver. "We sent notices. Many notices. If you chose not to open them, that's not our fault." And as for your deployment, well, that's unfortunate timing, but it doesn't change the process. Daniel realized then that Harold didn't just believe he was in the right he enjoyed. There was a smug confidence in his tone, like he'd pulled this trick before and gotten away with it. So that's it? Daniel asked. You steal land from soldiers and flip it for a profit? Harold's eyes narrowed. I think we're done here. If you have a problem, talk to a lawyer. The conversation was over, but Daniel's fight had just started. Walked out of the building with his jaw tight and his mind racing. A lawyer, Harold had said. Fine, he'd get one, but not just any lawyer. Daniel knew the military had legal teams that specialized in protecting service members from exactly this kind of thing. When he got home, he pulled out every piece of paper his brother had been saving for him. Sure enough, there were the unopened HOA letters, stacked in order like a breadcrumb trail to the theft. He read each one, noting the dates, the escalating threats, the final warning. Then he spotted something that made his pulse quicken. On one of the early letters, there was a line at the bottom. All residents are subject to HOA bylaws as defined in the 2003 Subdivision Expansion Agreement. Daniel knew for a fact his land had never been part of that expansion. In fact, when his father bought it, it was specifically excluded from HOA control. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, spreading out maps, property surveys, and copies of the original deed. He compared them to the HOA's jurisdiction map printed on their website. The two didn't match. In their map, his lot was shaded as part of their territory, but in the county's original map, was clearly outside the boundary. Someone had redrawn the lines without proper approval. It wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. Daniel realized then that this wasn't just about him. If they'd done this to his land, they might have done it to others people who didn't have the time, money, or resources to fight back. Maybe some had been bullied into paying fees they didn't owe. Maybe others had lost their land quietly, without ever realizing they'd been robbed. The more Daniel thought about it, the more determined he became. This wasn't going to be a case of you win some, you lose some. He wasn't just going to take them to court. He was going to tear apart the whole scheme and make sure the people behind it paid for every shady thing they'd done. The next morning, he made a call to the legal office on his base, and he explained the situation. The officer on the other end grew quiet. Sergeant Reeves. The officer said, if what you're telling me is accurate, they may have violated federal law. Specifically, the Service Members Civil Relief Act. What does that mean for me? Daniel asked. It means, the officer replied, you might have just handed us a case the federal government will be very interested in. For the first time since seeing that sign on his land, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. The HOA thought they'd taken advantage of a man who was too far away to stop them. What they didn't realize was that they'd just picked a fight with someone who had a bigger, stronger ally than they could ever imagine it. Daniel was ready to use every connection he had to get his land back. And maybe, it's just maybe, take down the entire corrupt machine that had tried to steal it. Daniel didn't waste a single day. The morning after he spoke to the military legal office, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the spread of documents in front of him. It looked like a crime scene laid out in paper maps. Deeds, letters, property tax records, and those smug HOA notices that still smelled faintly of printer ink. Every page told a piece of the story. And Daniel was determined to put the puzzle together. The first thing he did was print out the county's original zoning map from when his father bought the land. He placed it side by side with the HOA's current jurisdiction map from their glossy website. The difference was like night and day. His property, which had once been outside the HOA's borders, is now colored in with the same shade as the rest of the subdivision. It wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. Daniel knew enough about paperwork to understand that maps like this couldn't just be changed on a whim. Someone would have had to submit a revised plat map to the county, get it approved, and then update public records. But when he checked the county's filing records online, there was no such approval on file. In other words, the HOA's map wasn't official, it was a forgery. He took a deep breath. This was good damning, but it wasn't enough to win yet. He needed to dig deeper, find more violations, and build a case so strong that even The slickest HOA lawyer wouldn't be able to wriggle out of it. That afternoon, Daniel drove to the county clerk's office again, this time with a notebook in hand. He asked to see every document the HOA had filed in the last 20 years. The clerk gave him a look that said, "This is going to take a while." But Daniel didn't care. He sat there for hours, flipping through manila folders and scanning through PDFs on the old office computer. It didn't take long to find more red flags. There were inconsistencies in their meeting minutes dates that didn't line up, signatures that looked suspiciously similar, even votes that were supposedly unanimous but had no record of attendance. One document in particular made Daniel stop and stare. It was a notice of inclusion for several parcels of land, including his, claiming that all owners had been notified and had agreed to join the HOA. The problem? The signature next to his father's name wasn't his father's. Daniel had seen his dad's handwriting thousands of times. This signature was fake. Daniel made copies of everything. The clerk, who by now had grown curious, asked him, "You? Going after them?" "Yeah," Daniel said without looking up, "and I'm not stopping until they're buried in their own lies." Back at home. He called the military legal office again and explained what he'd found. The officer on the line was quiet for a moment before saying, "Sergeant Reeves, you've stumbled onto more than just a property dispute. If they forged documents and targeted you while you were deployed, this could fall under multiple violations, state, federal, and military protection laws." The officer told him to send everything, maps, letters, forged documents, to the legal office immediately. They would review it and decide the next step. Daniel felt a rush of satisfaction. Every piece of paper he sent was like loading another round into the chamber, but Daniel wasn't done digging. He decided to pay a visit to a few neighbors who'd lived near his lot for years. Some were older folks who had been there before the subdivision even existed. He knocked on doors, introduced himself, and asked if they'd had any trouble with the HOA. The stories poured out. One man said they'd tried to fine him for painting his shed the wrong shade of brown. A woman swore they'd threatened to seize her garden because it didn't meet uniform landscaping standards. Another told Daniel about a family who'd moved away after losing a small strip of land in the exact same kind of auction. Daniel had been caught in. The pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were hunting for opportunities. To grab land and flip it for profit, they were ruthless about it. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carmichael, invited Daniel in for tea. She had a stack of old letters from the HOA, and as she flipped through them, she shook her head. "They've been trying to push everyone out little by little," she said. "Most folks give in and pay whatever they ask. But your daddy never. Did he told me once, 'Over my dead body will they take this land?'" Those words hit Daniel hard. His father had fought to keep that land. Now it was up to Daniel to finish the fight. Over the next week, Daniel kept gathering evidence. He took photos of the land, the survey markers, and even the HOA's office. He documented every conversation, every file, every detail. By the end of the week, he had a thick binder labeled Green Pines HOA Corruption. When he met with the military legal team in person, they were impressed. One attorney, a tough-looking major with sharp eyes, flipped through the binder and said, "This is more thorough than most investigations we run ourselves." The major explained that under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, Daniel had significant protections while deployed. Any legal action involving his property should have been postponed until he returned, unless he explicitly waived that right. The HOA had not only ignored that law, they'd gone out of their way to target him knowing. He couldn't fight back in real time. The major leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Sergeant, I think it's time we bring in some heavier firepower." Within days, Daniel's case was escalated. Federal agencies got involved, requests for records were sent to the HOA, and word quickly spread around the subdivision that something big was brewing. Harold Peterson, the smug HOA president, must have felt the walls closing in, because he suddenly stopped returning Daniel's calls. Daniel didn't mind. He knew Harold would have to face him eventually, only next time. This wouldn't be in a plush office where Harold could smirk behind a desk. It would be in front of a judge, maybe even a federal one, with military lawyers tearing his operation apart piece by piece. And as Daniel left the base that day, binder in hand, he felt something he hadn't felt since before deployment, a sense of control. The HOA thought they'd stolen from a man who couldn't fight back. Instead, they'd woken up a soldier who was just getting started. Daniel was ready to go to war this time, on his own soil. The first sign that things were about to change came on a Monday morning when Harold Peterson walked into the HOA office to find two men in dark suits waiting for him. They weren't smiling, and they weren't holding coffee. They showed their badges, and Harold's usual smug expression flickered. Federal agents don't show up for minor neighborhood disputes, and deep down, he knew exactly why they were there. Across town, Daniel was sitting in a meeting room on base, listening as the military legal team went over the plan. The more they explained, the more he realized just how far this was going to go. It wasn't just about getting his land back anymore. This had turned into a full-scale legal operation. The Service Members Civil Relief Act was clear. Any foreclosure, lien, or forced sale against an active-duty service member without a proper court order was illegal. What the HOA had done wasn't just a technical violation. It targeted him deliberately, forged documents, and sold the land while knowing he was deployed. That combination had turned a civil issue into a federal one. But that wasn't all. During their investigation, the legal team had discovered something the HOA never wanted anyone to know. Part of the Green Pines subdivision, including Daniel's lot, sat on land that still had an old military easement dating back decades. It was a leftover from when the area was used for training exercises. And while the easement hadn't been enforced in years, it was still legally binding. In simple terms, the military still had rights to that, land rights the HOA had ignored completely. When the military's lawyers explained this to Daniel, they also told him something else. We can reclaim more than just your lot if we want. 2, we can repossess the entire section of land covered under that easement. Daniel didn't even try to hide his grin. Do it, he said. The next week was a blur of legal filings, court orders, and official notices. The HOA board members received thick envelopes stamped with federal seals ordering them to appear in court. Developers who had been planning to build on Daniel's lot suddenly found themselves cut off from their investment. And slowly, word spread to the residents of Green Pines, something big was happening. It wasn't going in the HOA's favor. On the day of the first court hearing, Daniel walked into the courthouse in uniform. He wasn't there to intimidate anyone. He simply wore it because he had to return to base afterward. Still, the sight of him made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Harold Peterson avoided looking at him, staring instead at a stack of papers in front of him like they might save him from what was coming. The military attorney spoke first, laying out the violations in simple, brutal terms, explained the forged documents, the illegal auction, the lack of court approval, and the blatant disregard for federal law. Then he dropped the bombshell about the military easement. This court should understand. The attorney said that not only was Sergeant Reeves' land wrongfully taken, but the HOA has been managing and profiting from land they never had legal control over. Under federal law, that land is subject to immediate repossession by the United States government. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Harold's lawyer tried to argue, but the judge cut him off. You're telling me your client sold land belonging to the federal government? The lawyer stammered. We weren't aware. That's not an excuse, the judge said sharply. By the end of that hearing, the court had ordered a temporary freeze on all HOA-controlled land within the easement area. That meant dozens of lots empty. Some with houses were now under federal review. Harold left the courthouse pale and tight-lipped, refusing to speak to the reporters. Waiting outside, but Daniel wasn't celebrating yet. This was just the beginning. The real move came 2 weeks later, when a convoy of official government vehicles rolled into Green Pines. Military personnel, federal agents, and county officials fanned out through the neighborhood, delivering official notices to every affected property. Some residents came out onto their lawns confused and worried. Others peeked from behind curtains. A few knew Daniel and waved him over. He explained, as gently as he could, that the HOA had been operating illegally and that the military was reclaiming the land tied to its easement. Not everyone took the news well. One man shouted that Daniel was ruining the neighborhood. Another accused him of doing this for revenge. But a surprising number of people thanked him quietly. admitting they'd been bullied by the HOA for years. As the notices were posted, Harold stormed out of the HOA office red-faced. "You can't do this," he shouted at one of the federal agents. The agent didn't even blink. "Sir, it's already done." Watching Harold sputter and stomp back inside was one of the most satisfying moments of Daniel's life. For months, Harold had been the one with all the power, smirking across desks and sending threatening letters. Now the tables had turned. There was nothing Harold could do to stop it. Over the next several weeks, the legal process moved quickly. The HOA was ordered to hand over all financial records for the past 10 years. The forged documents were sent to forensic experts. Several board members resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew they were jumping ship before it sank completely. The developer who had bought Daniel's lot tried to fight the repossession. But when faced with the combined weight of federal law and military rights, he backed down. The deed was transferred back to Daniel at no cost, but the real shock came when the court finalized the military's claim over the entire easement area. Green Pines HOA, once proud and untouchable, was stripped of control over a huge section of its territory. Overnight, they lost the power to collect dues, enforce rules, or sell land in that area. It was like cutting the legs out from under them. Daniel didn't dance in the streets or throw a victory party. He was satisfied, yes. But he knew there were still residents caught in the middle, people whose homes sat on land now technically. Under military jurisdiction, the government wasn't kicking them out, but they would have to work out new agreements to stay. For some, it was an inconvenience. For others, it was the end of years of harassment. Harold tried one last desperate move, filing an appeal. But by then, the evidence was stacked too high against him. The appeal was denied within weeks, and soon after, Harold's name appeared in the local paper not as HOA president, but as a defendant in a criminal investigation for fraud and forgery. Daniel heard about it while sitting on his porch one evening looking out over his land. Grass had grown back, the air smelled like pine again, and for the first time in months, felt like his place again. He knew the fight wasn't over for good people like Harold always found ways to pop up somewhere else, but here at least the battle was won. And as far as Daniel was concerned, Green Pines would never be the same again. The news spread through Green Pines like wildfire. By the time the sun came up on Monday morning, nearly everyone in the neighborhood knew the HOA was finished. The office was locked up, the board members had vanished, and the proud Green Pines sign at the entrance, once polished and freshly painted, now looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. Without the HOA's endless rules and patrols, the neighborhood felt different. Some people described it as freedom. Others muttered that it was chaos. Daniel didn't spend much time worrying about what the remaining residents thought. His land was back in his name, the deed resting in a new frame on his kitchen wall. Every time he glanced at it, he felt a small wave of satisfaction. It wasn't about the dirt or the grass, it was about the principle. That land was his, fair and square, and no one had the right to take it. The military had closed their case on the easement as well, officially confirming that a large section of Green Pines would remain under government jurisdiction for the foreseeable future. For most residents, this simply meant the HOA couldn't boss them around anymore. They still lived in their homes, still paid property taxes to the county, but now the overbearing fines, letters, and mandatory improvement charges were gone. Of course, not everyone was happy. There was a small group of homeowners who had been loyal to Harold and the HOA, either because they liked the strict rules or because they'd personally benefited from them. Those people avoided Daniel completely. If they saw him walking toward them, they'd turn the other way. Some even whispered that he had destroyed the neighborhood. Daniel ignored them. He knew the truth, and so did a lot of others. In fact, more neighbors than he expected began stopping by to thank him. An older couple down the road brought him a pie and told him how the HOA had tried to fine them thousands of dollars for leaving their RV in their driveway. During a family emergency, a single mother explained that Harold had once threatened to tow her car for being parked at an angle. These people were relieved, and they weren't shy about saying so. One evening, Daniel got a call from Mrs. Carmichael, the elderly neighbor who had told him about his father's promise to never give up the land. "Daniel," she said, her voice warm, "your daddy would be proud. You stood your ground. You didn't let them win." That meant more to him than any official court ruling. Meanwhile, Harold Peterson's world was falling apart. The criminal investigation into the forged documents and fraudulent property sales moved forward quickly. Harold tried to claim he had no idea about the forged signatures, but witnesses from inside the HOA office were eager to talk. One former board member gave a sworn statement that Harold had personally ordered the changes to the maps and instructed the staff to make it look official. Local newspapers ran the story, complete with side-by-side photos of the forged signature and the real one from Daniel's father. The difference was obvious, even to an untrained eye. Harold's polished public image crumbled overnight. He stopped showing up in town, his once impressive car sitting in his driveway gathering dust. Some of the other board members weren't so lucky either. At least 2 of them faced fines for their role in the illegal auctions. The HOA's bank account was frozen, and the Subdivision's former legal counsel quietly resigned, not wanting their firm's name attached to the scandal. Daniel didn't celebrate their downfall loudly. That wasn't his style. But he did feel a deep, quiet satisfaction knowing that people who had abused their power were finally facing consequences. With the legal battles behind him, Daniel turned his attention to what he had wanted all along building, something on the land. He started small, clearing the remaining debris from the HOA's so-called maintenance work, and planting a few young pine trees along the edges. Then he hired a local crew to put in the foundation for a small cabin. He worked alongside them whenever he could, hauling wood, hammering nails, and even learning how to fit the roof panels. The process was slow but steady, and with each step, the land felt more and more like home. One Saturday afternoon, as he was staining the porch railing, a little boy rode up on his bike and stopped at the gate. The boy said, "Dad says you're the guy who beat the HOA." Daniel laughed. "Something like that." The boy grinned. "That's cool. My mom said they were mean." Then he pedaled off down the road, leaving Daniel smiling. The cabin was finished just before winter. It wasn't big, just 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a porch that looked out over the trees, but it was exactly what Daniel had pictured during those long nights overseas. On the day he moved in, he raised an American flag on a tall wooden pole beside the porch. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a statement, reminder of who he was, what he'd fought for, and what no one could ever take from him again. Neighbors driving by would see it fluttering in the breeze, and for some, it became a quiet symbol of standing up to people who abused their authority. In the months that followed, life in Green Pines settled into a new rhythm. Without the HOA's constant interference, people began making small changes to their homes, painting their doors bright colors, planting gardens that didn't match their neighbors, and putting up decorations they actually liked. It was a little less uniform, a little more chaotic, but it felt alive. Daniel stayed out of the day-to-day neighborhood drama, at his cabin, his land, and his peace. Sometimes he would sit on the porch in the early morning, drinking coffee while the mist rolled through the trees, and think about how close he had come to losing it all. If he hadn't fought back, if he hadn't dug into the records, his father's land would be gone forever. One night, while talking to a friend from the military over the phone, the friend asked, "Was it worth it? All that time, all that stress?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It wasn't just about the land. It was about making sure people like that know they can't push people around. Not me. Not anyone." And deep down, he knew that was the real victory. Months later, Daniel got a letter from a stranger who lived 2 states away. The man had read about the case in the news and was dealing with a similar situation with his own HOA. He thanked Daniel for setting a precedent, saying it gave him hope that he could win too. Daniel folded the letter and tucked it into the frame behind his deed. It was a reminder that sometimes fighting your own battle ends up helping people you'll never even meet. The HOA, that once thought it could take whatever it wanted, was gone. The people who had run it were facing justice. And Daniel Reeves, soldier, son and now homeowner, had kept the promise his father once made. Over his dead body would they take that land, only now. Everyone in Green Pines knew it. and they knew one more thing: if they ever tried again, they'd have to face the man who had beaten them once, and who wouldn't hesitate to do it again. And so, with his flag flying high, Daniel finally had what he'd wanted all along. Just a piece of land, but the freedom to call it his own, with no one left to tell him otherwise.